Good
Hello,
morning.
hello, good morning and good evening, everybody, or good morning, wherever you are. I'll take just a few minutes to set the stage and then I'm going to hand over to you, okay, Alec?
Sure.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see some familiar names and some new names. My name is Zhang Mei. I'm the founder of WildChina. And I'm very proud to say this is our 51st event, virtual event for 2020, and also our last event. I'm very proud that my team and everybody worked very hard to fulfill our promise to bring China to you while we can't travel. And so next year with the vaccine, everything, we absolutely hope you'll come back and travel with us. Today we will discuss Alec Ash's first book, which is called, I think it's called Wish Lanterns in the UK, but China's New Youth in the US. And 中国新青年在中国, right? It tells the story of 6 Chinese millennials from their childhood in the 80s and to current day. And it paints this vivid picture of their struggles, their dreams, their failures, their successes. In short, it is a book about life of new youth in China. So we're very fortunate today. We have Alec joining us online. I think he just woke up and had a cup of coffee, but the audience will keep you entertained or you'll keep us entertained. I'll say a few words. Alec graduated from Oxford with a degree in English literature, and shortly after he made a move from the UK to a small village in Qinghai, Tibetan village, to teach English. That experience must have been extraordinary. I want to see that in a book someday. And he then went on to Beida, Beijing University, to study Chinese. And besides this book, Alec is, I'm sure you're working on another book right now, but he's also contributed to many prestigious journals, The Economist, The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and many more. And he's currently the managing editor of the LA Review of Books China channel. Just on logistics, I'm going to hand over the room to Alec to talk about his book for about 20 minutes. Then I'll come back and we will do some Q&A. Any questions you have, please input in the dialogue or Q&A section. We'll get to them as fast as we can. And without further ado, Alec, thank you for taking the time, and over to you.
Right. Thank you very much, Zhang Mei, and very happy to be here. And happy to be here in Zhang Mei's hometown, in fact. I am videoing from Dali in southwestern China, Yunnan province, where it's true, I've just finished my morning cup of coffee, but in my defense, as Zhang Mei knows, the sun only rises at 8 a.m. in Dali because we're 2 hours to the west of Beijing time. So I'm in the foothills of the mountains of Yunnan, having escaped from Beijing, and it's a more rural pace of life here. I'm in a village, having been in Beijing for the best half of the last decade. So Zhang Mei has very kindly introduced me already. Perhaps I'll do so again in the context of the book. So as she mentioned, I grew up in Oxford and then got as far away as Oxford, from Oxford as I could on graduating. And when I first went to live in Beijing in 2008, I became interested, as I was learning Mandarin, in the people of my generation, fellow students at Beida, at Peking University. And I wrote a blog about them called Six, which was just following the lives of 6 young Chinese people in their early 20s, as I was then as well. And then in 2012, after a stint in London, I went back to write full-time about China. And the fruit of that research and that writing was this book, Wish Lanterns, which has just been re-released in the US paperback under the title China's New Youth, a title which comes from a Chengdu journal, Xin Qingyan, or La Jeunesse, as Zhang Mei noted, in the early 20th century as part of the new culture movement. And this new paperback has a new preface, giving some historical context to the generation, and a new afterward, catching everyone up on the lives of the 6 people I follow in it. So yes, in this book, I also follow 6 young Chinese people in a narrative fashion, a different 6 from the original blog, and a 6 in which I hope capture a wide sliver of the generation. This is my generation. I was born in 1986. It's the post-Tiananmen generation. So the generation of young Chinese born after 1980, with no living memory of Tiananmen Square. These are the Balling-Ho, post-80s. Although really the people I write of are in this sliver of a generation born between 1985 and 1990. So I call them the Wedge Generation, because they're wedged between old and new China, and indeed, one hopes, opening it up, the thin end of the wedge, I suppose. Before them came the post-70s, the first generation really to grow up in a market China and to jump into the seas of enterprise. And then the generation after them, the Jiuling-Ho, the Ling-Ling-Ho, after 1990 and 2000. I know as little about them as you do, the youth today, but there's certainly something new all over again. And I think I've noticed that they're quite a lot more nationalistic and a lot more confident in China's role in the world. So there's this phrase in China, 3年一个代沟, a generation gap every 3 years, or some people have it as 5 years. So I really think it is possible to sort of granulate the generations in this way. A Chinese who would be born in 1980 and 1985 and 1990 would have totally different experiences of China while growing up. And the China that they're used to, that forms them, would be really radically different in character given the pace of change. So someone born in 1980 would still have likely experienced poverty or seen it at the very least. And someone in 1990, if they were growing up in a city, would be very used to this confident, even bullish new China that we see around us, which is leading the world in various aspects. They are a generation of firsts. They're the first single child generation. They're the first free market generation, really born in a sort of international capitalist economy and comfortable in that skin, having not known anything else. The first internet generation, as you could call my own in the West. The first generation exposed to foreign culture from birth and very native to and fluent in the language of American sitcoms. So in that respect, I've always felt that the people I write of have more in common with me, with my generation, separated by thousands of miles, than they do with their parents, separated by a few meters, but 20 or 30 years. They are so different to their parents, and often the relations with the parents is one of the biggest stress factors for them because of that generation gap and that difference. If you think of China squeezing in some 100 years of progress and industrialization into the last 40 years, then their parents would be the sort of equivalent of their grandparents or great-grandparents for us in the West, often in terms of experiences and values. Of course, in the 60s and the 70s, conformity and group identity was very important in China. Now individuality rules. And the older generation in China, as sometimes some stereotypes abroad, I found is quite critical of young Chinese, with these various appellages such as little emperors, Xiao Huangdi, that they're materialistic, that they're selfish, that they're brain dead, and so on, which I always felt fails to capture the range, the gamut of experience, the huge differences within the generation, from the rich second generation, the Floridai, to the self-dubbed Diaosi or penis hairs, the losers who don't have a penny to their name, and conceals the pressures and competition to succeed, and the diversity of opinion as well as experience. So what I was trying to do in the book was to convey that diversity and open a window into this generation simply through the life stories of 6 of them. So it's not even aiming to be comprehensive or a study. It's aiming to be narrative and literary, but through a range of different young Chinese from very different backgrounds and who geographically come from different areas of China, to sort of show rather than tell what it's like to be young in China. With the caveat that the people I wrote about then are now all in their early 30s. So it depends on your definition. So I thought that I would just quickly run through who the characters are, if that sounds good, Zhang Mei, and then we can chat. So I'm not sure.
Would you want Kendra to bring the map back so people can know?
Yeah, that would be great. That would be awesome. Yeah, I love that map. That was.
Kendra, can you do that? Or let's see.
Yeah, one minute. I'll get it right up.
Okay. Cool. So I'm not sure how many of the audience have read the book. There are 6 characters. 2 of them end up meeting and getting married in the middle of the book, and I can't see any way around revealing which 2 of those are. But at the point where I get to that, I will ask people to put their fingers in their ears if they don't want it spoilt for them. But I did want to update people on what the characters are up to now, to give some value to people who've read the thing. So the first character is Mia, and she's the one who's on the book. And you can see she's at the far top left there from Urumqi in Xinjiang. And it's a minor point of pride that, yes, my publisher did put an attractive young Chinese woman on the cover of the book to sell copies, but at least it's an attractive Chinese woman who's in the book rather than just someone that I found on Shutterstock. So Mia's from Xinjiang. She was born in 1990. She is a sort of fashionista, a fashion designer and professional, a former punk who really rebelled from her parents' vision of what she wanted to be. Very bright student, went to study in Tsinghua, and has done very well for herself. So she's now become a vlogger and a sort of social media influencer in this new economy of live streaming and so on in China. So she's very much embraced that, whereas, you know, her mum and her dad, she have no idea what she does really. And she's going from stride to stride. Interestingly, she is, it was always her dream to go to America and make it in the sort of fashion world of LA and Miami Beach. But last time I chatted to her, that had changed, partly because of the coronavirus, and also because of sort of, I think, China's rising clout in the world and rising wealth, that there's more money to be made here. So interestingly, the biggest change in her from sort of 4 or 5 years ago to now is that she now wants to stay in China and make her career here. And I think that's telling, that the brightest of China's young would now not as a knee-jerk reaction want to move to America to make it, but remain in China, where there are fruits of their own. The next character is Lucifer. You can see him on the map from Shijiazhuang, Hebei. I should say that these the names are their English names, not their Chinese names. Mia is Kong Xiaorui, Lucifer is Li Yan. But I use their English names for familiarity's sake in the book, and because they're quite fun. He called himself Lucifer to attract attention, no doubt, which is something he loves to do. This is what he looks like. He's a rocker. He's an aspiring superstar. Similar to Mia, he's one of the younger ones in the book, 1989, born on the outskirts of Shijiazhuang in Hebei. And he's still trying to make it as an international superstar. He used to be a rock musician. Now he's reinvented himself as a rapper. His Chinese name is Li Yan, so he's started calling himself Little Yan. He went on a TV talent show called Summer of the Bands, 乐队的夏天, which is a very popular streaming show in China, and unfortunately flopped somewhat. So you can see that on iQIYI. But he's still going at it and not giving up on his dreams, which indeed is a theme of the generation, although many of them have had to. Snail is from a village in Anhui. You can see him near the bottom of the map there. And he is a very different background. He's a farmer's son who worked hard at school to become a tech worker in computer science. He had his own struggles. He is a gamer, and he got addicted to internet games, particularly this one called World of Warcraft, 魔兽世界. And sort of internet addiction and gaming addiction is a not uncommon thing for this generation of young Chinese. So, and he had to drop out of college and then eventually struggled through and graduated and got to work. But this is all in Beijing. And since the book, he has subsequently moved back to his home province of Anhui because he finds it is cheaper. He's closer to family. And I think it's telling that his dream of making it in Beijing sort of was impossible because of the prices of living, of housing and everything. So he's decided to go back home and just had a second child who they named Dudu, which is the sound of a car honking. Fred is from right down at the bottom of the map, Hainan, that island dripping out of Guangdong. And she was born in 1985. She's the daughter of a Communist Party official, so comes from a much more sort of well-heeled background. She was a politics PhD at Peking University, and now she's teaching politics, comparative politics, and her story in the book is more of an intellectual story. It's about how her views of China, of the Communist Party, of statehood, of nationalism have changed, and she's very much a loyalist. She's very much a patriot. She'd be the sort of person who would be defending China if you were debating her, but she's also very thoughtful, very well read, and well versed in Western history and politics as well. So I wanted to tell her stories and convey her opinions to express what I think is quite a sort of mainstream support of the communist state among young Chinese. Since the book, she worked in a think tank in Hainan for a stretch on the South China Sea, which of course is part of China. She very firmly believes, and now she's in Beijing again. And interestingly, last time I chatted with her, she was complaining at the academic environment where everything's tightened in the Xi era, and she's found she's had to self-censor a lot and can no longer teach Western politics so openly, and she's very frustrated by that, as a lot of people are, including the people who are patriots. So at this point, plug your ears if you haven't read the book, because I'm going to tell you which two characters meet and get married. It's Dahai and Xiao, who are the two who were both born in 1985, and I tell their stories separately to begin with, but they meet at around half or 2/3 of the book and get married in a flash wedding. So that's the love story in there. Dahai is from Hubei, but he grew up on the outskirts of Beijing, and Xiao is from Heilongjiang, from a very far north. And both of them have had an element of compromise in their life, as a lot of young Chinese people had, where their dreams sort of come up against the brick wall of reality of what is possible, how to make a living, as it does for a lot of millennials, but especially in China, I think, with the competition involved of a generation the size of the entire US population, over about 400 million young Chinese. So Dahai was a sort of angry netizen type. Xiao was a shop owner and a dreamer, but now they both work for the same construction bureau. And they were dispatched after the book ended to Xinjiang. And they were there for 3 years to build the new subway in Urumqi. So, if it's possible to travel to Urumqi and on the subway, they built it. And now they are in Beijing again, building a highway, working on logistics of a highway which connects the 6th Ring Road, which is very, very far out of Beijing, probably somewhere in Inner Mongolia. So those are the 6 characters. That's what they're up to now. And the book just tells their story in this sort of chronological fashion, from childhood really to sort of end of adulthood, in hopefully an engaging and a literary fashion, which sort of carries you with the story. And by the end of it, the aim is that you have a bit of a feel for what it's like to be young in China, what the challenges are, what the dreams are, what the hopes and the aspirations are, and of course what the context and the broader political and historical context of all of that is. And China is changing so fast that for the young people I see in the street today, they have a totally different background as well. But this generation that I write of is one which I still think has that transformational potential, and is something totally different to what China has ever seen before. So it's one which I think is valuable and important to understand. Thank you for listening to.
Thank you, Alec. Amazing presentation about these characters. I have to tell you, as I was reading the book, my favorite was Xiao Xiao and Dahai. I'm sure you have different answers, and I don't think you want to give an opinion of favoring anybody. But I want to start with a side question, since one of our audience is also quite curious. Your home looks really beautiful. Tell us about it. How old is the house? But you can go from the house. Please paint a picture for us of Dali. That's my hometown, but some of the audience may not know. Why did you choose to go there?
Well, as ever in a Zoom meeting, the most interesting thing is always the background and never the person talking. I couldn't agree more. I live in a wooden home in a village on the outskirts of 6 kilometers north of the old town of Dali, which is a ancient Ming era town, about 100 kilometers west of Kunming, the provincial capital. Although the history of Dali stretches way back further to the 8th and 9th century Nanzhao dynasty. And it used to be a separate Buddhist kingdom, which wasn't even part of the Chinese state until the Ming. So it has a storied history and a beautiful natural environment, squeezed between the Tangshan mountain range and the waters of Arhai. And I'm in a village at the foothills of the mountain. The house is all made of these wooden beams in the bi-ethnic style. Zhang Mei, are you Han or Bai?
I circled around before landed in the Han family.
Yeah, so the local ethnicity in this village is Baizu, and my neighbors are constantly talking in Bai, and I can't understand a word of it, unfortunately. I'm starting to take lessons. So it's an ethnic village, and all of the houses are made of woods. Actually, there isn't a single nail in these beams. They're all made of interlocking pieces of wood. And I'm on the upstairs, but from my window, I can see the mountains, and then from the other window, I can see the lake. So it's a beautiful environment. It's a nice writing spot. And I came here to really escape the smog and the traffic of Beijing after the best part of a decade. And that's also what I'm writing about here. I'm now following the stories of people, many of them young, but really from all generations, who are trying to get away from the city and find a sort of more peaceful, quiet life out in the country, a sort of Tuscan sun, Provence cliche almost. But I find it interesting that has come to China, and that people are rejecting city life and development. to move out and grow their own vegetables in the sort of China's back to the land movement. So I am writing about that. It's a story and an environment that Zhang Mei knows much better than I do because she grew up in it. But as with everything in China, things change very quickly. So I'm sure next time she gets to visit, she'd be surprised at but also some of the developments and changes and the sort of bohemian bourgeois elements of life here as well.
Right. Yeah. No. As you were saying, 3 years a generation. I'm already a generation away from Dali. No, actually, not quite. A third of a generation. So it's interesting.
No, it's not a ham.
Yeah, someone was asking if that was a ham.
I'm not sure what you're looking at.
I think it's the yellow paper hung on the beam.
Oh no, that's a tanka.
Oh, that's a tanka. Okay.
That's a kata, a Tibetan scarf.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, this new book is about, if I'm right, 新大理人, the new generation that moved from the city.
新移民, right? The new migrants, yeah.
Right. And since you live in Dali, and me being from there, I know the local Dali youth, we all still, well, I still think of myself as a Dali person. We call ourselves 家乡宝, homebody, the ones who never want to leave.
Yeah.
And so do you find the youth who are from Dali and chose to stay in Dali very different from the characters that you wrote in China's New Youth? Because almost all the characters in China's New Youth migrated to a better life in bigger city. And these ones chose to stay.
Yeah. It's there are lots of mirror images in my current project. And of course, for other locals here who don't want to leave. But there, I think the biggest factor tends to be socioeconomic. And indeed, that is the biggest factor of everyone in China, because I think a lot of these people, like my neighbor who's my age, he would love to get a job in Kunming or Beijing. He'd love to get a job in Xiaguan, but he can't necessarily. Whereas the people who do migrate, who do make it to cities, often tend to have, a better education now, college education, which I think is closer to what it's like in the West. Whereas for their parents' generation, they would go and be migrant workers, but these people would now want to have more office jobs. But if you don't have the education or the background for that, people tend to stay in the area. And most of my neighbors my age work in construction, right? Gaifangzi, because that's what is happening here. And so there's actually a lot of work in the Dali area because it's developing so fast. Now, there's lots of excellent books which have been written about rural China on its own right. In Wish Lanterns, I was writing about young people moving to the city, right? They all come from these different corners of China and they all converge on Beijing. They also all have university educations. Although Snail comes from a very poor family, they're all privileged in that respect. And that was a conscious decision because I wanted to focus on this sort of up and coming young city Chinese. And then what I'm now writing about is people from the city who are moving away to the countryside. So it's the sort of exact opposite of what the story was 10 years ago. And after this sort of 30-year urbanization and migration into the cities from the country, I find it fascinating that now people are rejecting that and saying, well, actually, this isn't what it's all cut out to be, and that we want to kind of come back to the land and find a different life. And then, as Zhang Mei points out, there are people who are locals, who are Bendiren, and they, never left, or, they have, because there are so many people who have left this area. I would say in Dali, actually, I was surprised at how many people don't leave, whereas most other villages I go to, they're empty. There's just very old people and very young people, and everyone else has left. But because Dali has something of its own economy, there are a lot of people who just stayed. And if you were in a place like this, you wouldn't want to leave either.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. Now, since you mentioned
Berkeley isn't bad either.
What was that?
Berkeley isn't bad either. No.
I call it California here.
we call it that here too.
So it's very similar weather, similar plants. That's why I love it here. Now this question goes to one of your comment earlier. Your book in Chinese, 中国新青年, and which came out in 2016, and 陈独秀的新青年杂志 started in 1915, right? Almost exactly 100 years apart. And Chen Duxiu's New Youth magazine started at the time when the revolution of 1911 drove out the last emperor, but then eventually failed to establish a true Republic of China. Right? So the China was weak on the international stage, and the youth of China were just angry, but they took to the street, they took actions to really change and inspire the May 4th and all that, right? So do you think 100 years later, if you were to look in Chen Duxiu's eyes, would he approve of this current generation of youth? Is this the youth that he fought for?
It's an excellent question. And I wish I could see into the mind of Chen Duxiu. So yes, the title New Youth comes from that magazine, La Jeunesse, Xin Xingyan, which was emblematic of the aspirations of China in its early republic, right? So they've overthrown the Qing in 1911. Then comes along this new culture movement where people like Chen Duxiu and Lu Xun and the likes were trying to carve out a new identity for the nation. And it was a youthful identity, right? Get rid of the old guard, out with the old, in with the new. And in this opening essay of the magazine called Jingao Qingnian, so a sort of respectfully tell the young people, he is writing directly to the youth of China, saying, basically throw out the old guard. He uses the metaphor of corrupt cells in the body, which sort of the youthful cells need to come in and expurgate. And that's sort of what happened. Interestingly, because just 4 years later, in 1919, you had the May 4th movement, which is this very youth-led nationalistic movement, sort of anti-Japanese after World War I, but very much for sort of China's new identity. And China has this long-standing legacy of youth protest that Chen Duxiu was calling for. Much of it was associated with the Communist Party. Chen Duxiu actually founded the Communist Party with the librarian of Beida, Li Dazhao, in 1921, although he was expelled 8 years later. Read about his life in Jiang Mei's neighbors, Orville Schell's excellent book, Wealth and Power, which has a good chapter on him. But really, through the communist era, there's also this legacy of youth protest, right? Of sort of standing up and, trying to change China. Red Guards in 1960s, they're it's teenage rebellion. It's iconoclasm, it's anti-feudal. The Beijing Spring of 1978, which was sort of pro-democracy. Again, it was a young guy, Wei Jingsheng, he was 28, a former Red Guard, who proposes the fifth modernization of democracy. Again, the young pushing for change. And of course, in the 80s, you had a number of student protests in 86, 87, and of course, 1989. So it's an excellent question. Have we connected this thread of youth protest or push for change? And if Chen Duxiu was alive today, he would probably be as despairing as some of the rest of us are as to the sort of political aspirations of the youth, because there simply is no appetite for protest, no appetite for sort of quick political change in that model or in that legacy. And what there is that there is quite a high level of support for the nation. And, the same nation that their forebears in the Tiananmen generation were protesting to reform. And then in May 4th movement 100 years ago that their forebears were protesting in order to form. So I think the support for the nation in young Chinese comes from a number of factors. It comes from education, the campaign for patriotic education, which started in 1990 as a result of the Tiananmen protests. I think it also is a reaction against what we might call Western hubris, I think, and some of the Western media, which has been very sort of anti-China, and whether for right or wrong, that has had a backlash in China, which is very noticeable, very identifiable, where young Chinese people want to sort of defend their nation, as Fred does in the book, and a genuine pride in China's accomplishments. So I think it's very noticeable how the support for the nation and a sort of rejection of protest legacy is different to their ancestors. But there's a continuation of that legacy, I think, in various aspects. One is nationalism, because, you know, Chen Zixi was a nationalist. The May 4th youth were nationalists, and there's a lot of nationalism in young China today, even more so than the generation I was writing about, these young wolf warriors. I think that's quite well documented. The torch is very much carried forward on the fringes of Greater China, in Taiwan and Hong Kong. That is obvious for everyone to see. And in various fields of activism, from feminism to environmentalism, to indeed socialism and Marxism in some student groups. There's an activist strand to young China, which I think continues the legacy, although it's been very much tightened up on in the Xi era. And finally, I think that the generation is more socially liberal and socially open than their parents, and that, while not directly political, I think has a cultural and socially transformative effect on China at the ground level as they grow up and come of age. I think they change the fabric of China in that respect, simply because they are of the world. They, you know, a lot of them studied or are studying in America and come back, and whatever their political support of the CCP in a one-party state, I think they are more sort of socially changed by that. The globalization of China, I think, is very much seen in this generation. But whether that will sort of translate into any political change, I think very unlikely. I think that liberalism is very much filtered out by the great machine of the CCP if you join it. So I wouldn't hold breath for any internal reform. I think it'll be a much slower process. But it is interesting to me that that Xi Jinping's great slogan, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, or make China great again, uses the semiotics of youth, you know, a rejuvenation. So I think that's always been a part of China's story, change and youth and new things coming in, and continues to be. The problem is that Xi's China dream is conceived of as national rather than individual dreams, as it is in America.
But a natural sort of basis for all of this is a high level of economic and physical comfort to youth of this generation, right? That's why you were talking about the lack of change. Now, you mentioned some of this, but I want to probe a little bit more, and I see a lot of questions coming in, so we'll get to them. My last question. In the US, I think there is a model youth. Maybe the best word I could use to describe is woke, right? They care about social, gender, economic equity. They care about the environment. And ideally, they would either work for Teach for China or Goldman Sachs. I don't know if I'm correct or wrong, sort of talking about US generations like that. Is there a model youth? Can you describe, if there's one, what do they look like? I think you touched on some of this a little bit earlier.
A model youth. You know, I think the days of Lei Feng are behind us. So it wouldn't be that. I don't think I can. I think that's the point, that the generation I was writing about was, I think, one of the first in history, or maybe the second after the He, where you could be different. You could be an individual and follow your own star rather than the star of Mao Zedong. So I think the point of it is that there is no sort of particular one model, and I'm very, conscious and aware that I'm just writing about 6 different people, and that there are various sort of lacunas in there. There's no one who's LGBT. There's no one from a different ethnicity. They're all Han. They all end up in the city. So really, you can cast the net a lot wider and capture a lot of different aspects of it. I see a question from Ludwig. Hi, Ludwig. That they're all people who, Westerners can relate to, and who can relate to Westerners. And I think that's broadly true, although not all of them. There's only a couple of them who speak good English. I was doing all of the research in Chinese and so forth. But I was focusing on urban young Chinese with, education. So the model for that would be, ambitious and driven, and different to their, and wanting to sort of cast their own shadow on sort of new China, rather than following their parents' aspirations for them, which would be very different.
Yeah, it's interesting. The reason I ask this question is I got the same impression from just living in China and reading your book, that it's very hard to put my fingers on this one type. It is the diversity that's impressive. So I'm going to go to the first question from Kyle Oberman, since he was our speaker last time on the environment, national parks. I think he's probably working on a book of his. The question is technical. How did you take notes on your stories from the field in such detail that enables you to create a book out of it?
Yeah, I'm always a big fan of process questions. Talk about craft, and maybe I'll answer. I think I saw a previous question of how did I meet the 6 people, so I'll do the 2 of them together. Okay. I met the 6 through various different means. I think one of them was a contact of a contact. One of them I reached out to some professors in Beida. Some of them were on, I found online through apps and sort of posts in BBSs on Baidu and so forth. All of them knew that I was writing a book, that they would be in it, and agreed to be in it from the start. But the initial process of meeting them, and really the first month or so getting to know them, I didn't even have my notebook out. I was asking general questions. I was trying to give a little bit of myself as well, and sort of say why I wanted to write their stories. And this was also a sort of audition process where I was meeting a lot of people, and then of course ended up choosing the 6 out of the sort of 20 or 30 who I interviewed initially. And then only then, after that sort of first process, did I take the notebook out, and I started doing sort of lengthier interviews. So the book is back reported, and then about sort of the first half to 2/3 of it, until about here in the book, this first half would be stuff I got from interviews with them about their childhood, from going back to their hometowns, talking to their parents and friends and so on, and looking at old photos and videos and so on, which they all were very generous in providing. So, obviously trying to be as accurate as I could there, but it's all what sort of they and their friends were telling me about their childhoods. And then that final half or third of the book is sort of the story picks up from where I meet them. And then I can actually be going with them to see what they're doing, following their stories in real time. I can have some set scenes where I go along and report a gig or go to Dahai and Xiaoxiao's wedding, and I'm there to witness it firsthand. So there's sort of two different processes of reporting. The stuff I can witness firsthand, and then the back reported stuff I can only glean from interviews. But yes, lots of notes, lots of videos, lots of photos, and then you select and form a narrative out of it. You know, and in that process of selection and storification, you change it, right? Because you're selecting which details to include and what order to put them in. So, you know, not nonfiction. Everything is accurate. You know, everything is factually true in the book, but the process of making a story out of it, of course, is filtered through my own perspective and what I find interesting and what I think foreign readers would be interesting. So that's the process.
A follow-up question on the process. As you were taking notes, were you already writing the story, or you did all these interviews for like 2-3 years and wrote everything in a year?
The latter, basically. I tried writing as I went, and I just found I didn't know what the voice of the book was yet. And I was writing scraps here and there, and I found I just needed to sort of finish the story in my mind, get all of the interviews material, and then basically knocked out the book in a single chunk. And that's sort of what's happening with me
how long
now.
Did it take you?
Well, so I think that's just how I work.
Yeah. How long did the actual writing take you?
9 months. Yeah.
Very cool. Very exciting. Okay. Do you want to...
Having a baby.
Sorry?
Like having a baby.
Exactly, like having a baby. Are you having your next baby faster or slower?
Oh, God. Well, I don't know. Is it easier the second time?
I don't know. I had C-section. Sorry, too much detail. So there's another question here. Do Chinese youth consider social media or do they sort of start to have a better concept, or has the concept of privacy starting to take root given the AI and facial recognition? This is a question submitted for Eileen Liu.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that one. I think there are people who really follow tech and social media. Did you mention Matt Sheehan's on this call? He'd be a good person to ask that too.
Next time we're talking about this one.
I certainly, internet and social media and tech platforms have transformed, you know, the lives of this generation as they have for us, and are woven into the fabric of of the experience of not just being young in China, but being in China. And there have been privacy concerns and complaints around AI and facial recognition, and you can see those items in the news. I do notice that they all seem to come from sort of better educated city people. I don't think the majority of people in like my neighbors here in the village would give a stuff about privacy around facial recognition, but definitely there are stories of backlash around that. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops.
Interesting. Now I'm going to move on to the next question, which is an excellent question. Do you think, this is from Qiao Liang, do you think this trend of people moving from Beijing to Dali, this sort of new immigrant trend in China, similar to the counter-urbanization of the Western world? Because they also heard in the Western world, after people move back to the rural area, they don't quite as good a fit, or things didn't turn out as they expected, and ended up going back to the big cities in the end. So what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, that's a common story. Sorry, I've been distracted by my dog who's come to get some attention.
So cute.
She's always very confused when I start talking to an inanimate box of metal, and she thinks I'm talking to her. So yes, there's a lot of people who come here with this great ambition that I'm going to live in the countryside, and I'm going to grow my vegetables, and I'm going to wear hemp clothes, and you know, dance naked in the fields, and then after a couple of years they give up and go back to the city, partly because there isn't many ways for them to make money here. So that's very common. And I think that there are commonalities with the sort of middle classes in Europe and America who, achieved a degree of wealth and then got their weekend home or just repaired entirely to the countryside, whether it's upstate New York or Provence or Tuscany.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of that in Dali. There's a lot of rich and sort of Balfahu, a lot of rich and nouveau rich people in Dali who are coming up and buying a courtyard like mine or better than mine and then renovating it in order to escape the smog and so on. So yeah, I think the counter-urbanization, the back to the land elements, I think there are similarities, but with Chinese characteristics. And one of those characteristics, yes, is sort of facing up to the reality of what it is to actually sort of grow your own vegetables and drink mountain walk, and so some of them decide that actually the city isn't all that bad.
Okay, next question is, Eric said, thank you for the book and the presentation, wonderful. Could you please say a little more about the current environmentalism that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think that in a sort of more comprehensive fashion, again, there are experts who follow this topic and various books on the topic that you can read about environmentalism in China. Speaking purely from what I know, there's a strong environmental streak here in Dali, and a lot of my friends back in Beijing, some of them ran environmental NGOs. So I think there's a very strong consciousness of environmental protection. It was closely linked to the concerns over smog levels in Beijing. Some 8-10 years ago, that was the big story. And that's one aspect where it's really condoned by the state to complain about the environment and seek environmental protection, whereas that's not the case for many other social issues, even such apparently innocuous ones like feminism are sort of no-go topics. So I've been very struck by how widespread environmental consciousness is among a lot of well-educated young Chinese, and again, it's not among the people who aren't so privileged, or my neighbors in the village. There's I live in a beautiful village, and then there's a big pile of trash just up the mountain road. So as always, it's a complex story, but a lot of young people, both in the cities and the people who come to Dali to live this sort of eco-friendly lifestyle, are aware that China has an environmental crisis, aware that the world has a climate crisis, and want to do something about it. So that's very encouraging.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to your friend Ludwig. Would you like to? Shall I read the question? The six characters in the book are all people Westerners can relate to, and they themselves can relate to Westerners as well. There's a large group of people who don't belong to that category. And if you could choose a number of the other group of people, what sort of people would you choose and peek into their lives?
Yeah. So as I said, I sort of consciously wanted to follow this sliver of sort of young Chinese in the city, coming up in the city. If I were to talk about a totally different generation who perhaps are sort of further removed from the West, gosh, well, I think Ludwig's neighbors in Dali would be an interesting one. I think perhaps because I'm in Yunnan, I'm more interested in minority cultures and how they sort of fuse with or operate within a Han dominant state. I think that might be a really interesting study, maybe for someone else to write, because all of the characters in my book are Han, and Mia is Han Chinese in Xinjiang, which is very common. More than half the people in Xinjiang are Han. But a whole different context and story would be, you're really getting under the skin of what it means to come from a different ethnicity with a different language in a Han dominant state. And that's not the book that I'm writing, but I'd be very interested to read it.
Well, you're in the perfect place to write your third book, right? Yunnan has 25 ethnic groups out of the 55 that China has. That's besides Han, right?
Not sure I'm qualified to write it, but it would be an interesting one. Yeah,
that would be an interesting one. Moving to the Q&A section, Sandra Pan asked, "What is the view the millennials in China think of America now? Do they have any aspirations?" You mentioned Fred, me not wanting to come anymore, but in general, do they still have aspirations to come west?
Great question, and I think it's changing, and in some ways sort of too early to tell what the effects and the impacts of this year will be on that question. There's been a lot of xenophobia this year, and the coronavirus has been recast as a foreign virus, as indeed I suppose it is in terms of transmission now. Combine that with a lot of the protests that are happening around the world, and some of the crises in democracy in America and elsewhere. I think really quite rapidly the sort of the view of the West and America specifically has changed, and that's coincided with rising confidence in China and Chinese might, especially among the next generation of young Chinese, those born after, say, 1990 or even after 2000, who are very used to China having this heft and might in the world, and who are indeed fed images of that in newspapers and movies and things like that. Li Hailo or Zhongguo, that kind of stuff. So I think it's changing, but I also wouldn't go too far in that direction. I think people are a little bit too hasty to talk about, decline of America and rise of China as if it's going to happen, next year. America is still, richest country in the world, most powerful country in the world, and of immense appeal to so many young Chinese, especially those from backgrounds who are able to consider coming to the West. So I teach English literature on the weekends to buy my noodles, and I teach Shakespeare to the sort of young rich Beijingers, and all of them still want to apply to Harvard and LSE and so on. So I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I think it's a more subtle change in the fabric of how people talk about America, and it's no longer China trying to follow America's model. It's hey, China has its own model to offer.
Very interesting. Yeah, I'll combine these two questions. Do you speak Cantonese, Mandarin, besides, and what other languages do you speak? And do you plan to live in China for the rest of your life?
No to both of them. I don't speak Cantonese, and I don't plan to live in China for the rest of my life. But,
Mandarin, but you're
I speak Mandarin, and I'm happy living here for the time being.
A follow-up question from Ludwig, and this I think will be our last question. As someone a generation older, I think I can say that the late 20s, early 30s are the period when, as you mentioned, reality strikes, aspirations meet frustrations, etc. So as you're still in contact with your characters, are you collecting material for a follow-up book, or do you dare to make predictions for their lives? Excellent question.
I'm still in touch with all of the people in the book. I feel lucky to say that I could consider all of them friends as well as subjects. You're absolutely right that many of them came up against a bit of a brick wall in the early 30s, where some of those dreams came up against reality, although Lucifer, for one, is ignoring it and continuing in his dreams. I've I think everyone, it's a universal story really of growing up and then your forming your identity, just as China is forming its nationwide identity after the changes of the sort of chaos of the mid 20th century. China is figuring out, what does it want to be? What does it want to be now that it's rich and developed? What does it want to be? What are its values? What are its models? Just developing isn't enough. I think that's the question now. What now? And it's the same question that I think young people ask themselves in the late 20s, trying to find their path in life, their identity, who they are, and then coming up against, realities of what they can be in the early 30s. So I think in that respect, China, contemporary China is like someone maybe coming into its early 30s. It's had the debutante years of the maybe marked by the Beijing Olympics. It's gone through the teenage growth spurt of the 90s and early 2000s. Now it's sort of arrived. It's richer. It still has a lot of problems. It's figuring out how to be part of the world, what it wants to be. It's going in a very sort of, I think, repressive political direction, which I think is very sad. But in that respect, it's like someone in its early 30s where its identity is really forming. So as with the individual characters, so too with the nation, so too perhaps with myself. But I can't offer any predictions, I'm afraid, as to what will come next.
Well, let's hope. Let's all hope in 2021 it's all a brighter future for us all, for you, for your characters, for the world, for China too, for China and US, right? We are out of time. I just want to say thank you, Alec, for such a great conversation, a wonderful read, and wish you lots of luck with your next book. We can't wait to read that in our book clubs. Thank you. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
And last bit, I just want to say thank you all for joining us this past year. This is our last event. Come back and join us in January. We will be reading The Good Women of China, chatting with the author Xin Ran. That's going to be towards the end of the month. And sometime in the middle of the month, we have a fourth session of Taste of China with China Institute. All these information on our website, wildchina.com. Do join us. And in closing, I just want to say I'm extremely, extremely grateful for all of you who stayed with our online virtual events throughout this pandemic. Without you, I'm not sure if we would have stuck with it, 51 sessions. But we absolutely are committed to continue counting next year. And I thank my team as well. In our Chinese Bishan Jiangtang, we're offering a special membership for those interested in exclusive conversations with travel industry leaders. So join us. You can find all this information in our WeChat and wildchina.com. Thank you. Thank you, Alec. Thank you, Kendra. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy New Year and happy holidays. Enjoy Dali for me.
Christmas all. Bye-bye.
Bye.